Berlin, 1942. The room had no windows. It had never needed them. What it needed was silence, precision, and the particular kind of attention that Hilda Schiller had been training toward since she was 19 years old, the ability to hear a signal inside noise to separate the meaningful from the meaningless at a frequency most people could not distinguish. She sat before the radio console with her headset on and her fingers resting on the key, and she transmitted the coordinates she had been given, and she did not know where those coordinates led, and she had not asked because in the unit where she worked, you did not ask. You transmitted. The coordinates went somewhere. The war was elsewhere. She was 22 years old. Texas, 1944. The heat arrived before the train stopped. It came through the gaps in the wooden car walls and settled into everything: the clothes, the hair, the skin, until it stopped feeling like temperature and started feeling like pressure, like the air itself was leaning against you. Hilda Schiller stood in the thin stripe of shade offered by the woman next to her and looked out through a gap in the slats at a landscape that was nothing like anything she had prepared herself for. Flat, enormous, the color of old bone. The train slowed. The sound of chains shifted as the women redistributed their weight. 12 of them linked 4x4 the metal-worn familiar over 3 weeks of Atlantic crossing and truck transit and processing facilities. The grooves on Hilda's wrists had deepened past discomfort into a kind of acceptance. This was how the world was shaped now. She had stopped noticing the weight. The doors opened. The light hit her like something physical. Not warmth, but force, the specific assault of a Texas June morning that had already been building heat for 3 hours before any of them arrived to experience it. Hilda stepped down from the car, and the ground was dry and red, and the sky was a color she did not have a German word for, something beyond blue. Something that suggested the blue had been burned away and replaced with something more elemental. Camp Hearn spread before them. Wooden barracks in rows guard towers at the corners, wire fencing that caught the light and threw it back. The camp was new enough that construction workers were still visible at the far end, hammering in the heat. Nearly 4,000 prisoners were held here, most of them men, Afrika Korps soldiers captured in North Africa, but one section had been designated for approximately 100 German women gathered from various captures across occupied Europe. Hilda walked in chains toward a processing building and tried to memorize the distance between the fence and the horizon. Inside the processing was efficient and impersonal. Photographs, fingerprints, numbers assigned, names recorded in ledgers by men who did not look up when they asked for them. Then clothes, simple cotton dresses in faded colors, donated apparently by American civilian organizations, whose members had not considered that German women might be built on different proportions than the dresses assumed. The garments hung loose and wrong on most of them. In the processing line, Hilda became aware of the woman 2 positions ahead of her. Sieglinde was 30 years old, though she carried herself with the certainty of someone who had spent years in positions of small authority. She had been, Hilda would learn gradually, a low-level propaganda coordinator in Hanover, someone whose job had involved producing materials rather than using weapons, which she clearly considered a meaningful distinction. She was watching the American guards with the careful attention of someone cataloging information for later use. When a young guard grabbed Lieselotta's arm and shoved her toward the medical station, Lieselotta, who was visibly 6 months pregnant and moving carefully, Hilda stepped forward without thinking. She put herself between Lieselotta and the guard and said nothing, simply occupied the space. The guard looked at her. Sieglinde's hand closed around Hilda's forearm from behind. "Don't," Sieglinde said in German. "You'll make it worse." Hilda did not move. The situation held for 3 seconds. Then another voice cut through it, American level, carrying the particular authority of someone who was used to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. Sergeant Harman Slaugel was 34 years old, and he had the face of a man who had recently received news that had restructured everything he understood about the future. His brother had died at Normandy 19 days earlier. He was not processing this information in any way that was visible. He had put it somewhere internal and was continuing to function, which was the only available option, and which was costing him something he was not accounting for yet. He stepped between Hilda and the young guard with the unhurried movement of someone resolving a situation rather than escalating it. He looked at Hilda for a moment with an expression that was not kind and was not cruel and was something more unsettling than either. Then he said quietly enough that only she heard, "Get in line, I won't say it twice." She got in line. But she noticed that Slagle, when he turned back to his post, paused for half a second and looked at the pregnant woman. And he said something to the young guard that she could not hear, and the young guard's posture changed. She filed that away. The processing concluded. They were assigned to the women's section of the compound, a row of barracks separated from the main prisoner population by additional fencing. Hilda found a bunk near the window which offered a view of the perimeter wire, and beyond it the flat Texas distance. She lay on the mattress with her wrists still marked from the chains which had been removed for processing and then replaced, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about the coordinates she had transmitted in Berlin and whether she would ever know what they had become. That evening, Sieglinde sat on the edge of her bunk and spoke quietly to the room in general, which was her way of speaking to everyone without appearing to address anyone in particular. She said that the Americans were studying them, that every small gesture of cooperation would be used against them, that the correct posture was minimum engagement and maximum observation. She said this with the confidence of someone who had been trained in the mechanics of influence and believed those mechanics applied universally. Hilda listened and said nothing. The next morning, a man named Lester Colby came to Camp Hearn. He was 59 years old and he owned 5,000 acres of pasture land southwest of the camp, and he needed workers. The war had taken most of his ranch hands in one direction or another, either into uniform or into the defense factories that were paying wages no rancher could match. He arrived in the camp's administrative office in the clothes of someone who worked outdoors in all-weather denim, worn pale at the knees. Boots were sold twice a hat that had been a specific color once and was now the color of prolonged use. Beside him stood Fritz Hoffmann, a German-American from Fredericksburg, who had grown up speaking both languages and was now in demand as an interpreter across the camps of Central Texas. The camp commandant reviewed the labor request paperwork while Lester stood and waited. Lester was a man who had spent his life in negotiation with things that did not negotiate conventionally, whether cattle land, and he had developed a patience that was not passive but attentive. When the 12 women were brought into the administrative room, Lester Colby did not look at their faces first. He looked at their hands, then their wrists, then the chains. His jaw moved once. Then he looked at the commandant. What followed was not a long conversation, but it was a decisive one. Lester said through Fritz Hoffmann that chains were a workplace safety hazard around livestock and equipment, that they created injury risk for workers and animals both, and that he would not take chained workers onto his property. The commandant cited security protocols. Lester said that if the women were too dangerous to unchain, they were too dangerous to work his ranch, and he would find other arrangements. The commandant had heard versions of this argument before. The labor shortage was not abstract. The civilian contractors had leverage that the military infrastructure of the camp genuinely needed. He made the calculation. Remove the chains. The guard with the keys moved through the group. The sound of each lock opening was small and precise. When the connecting chains fell, they hit the concrete floor to the sound that filled the room completely, a sound that lasted less than a second and seemed to last much longer. Hilda looked at her wrists. The grooves were still there, red and sore, the skin strange without the weight it had been carrying. She lifted her arms experimentally. Around her, the other women stood very still, some with their hands raised slightly, testing the absence. Lisa Lotta was crying without sound, wiping her face quickly. Lester stepped forward to warn. He spoke, and Fritz Hoffmann translated with the slight, careful quality of someone making sure each word landed correctly. You'll work hard. We'll treat you fair. You need something, you tell the foreman. You have problems, you report them. He paused. He looked at each woman in turn. You won't need chains here, not on my ranch. Your people first. Prisoners second. Fritz Hoffmann's voice caught very slightly on the last sentence, as if he was uncertain for a moment that he had heard correctly. Hildy stood in the administrative room of Camp Hearn with her free wrists and her marked skin and looked at a 59-year-old Texas rancher who had just said in plain English the most radical thing she had heard in 3 years of war. In the corner of the room, Sergeant Harmon Slagle stood with his arms crossed and his face arranged into its customary expression of controlled assessment. When the chains hit the floor and Hilda looked up, his eyes met hers for exactly 1 second. She saw that he had memorized her face. That evening, Hilda lay in her bunk in the women's barracks and looked at the ceiling. She was not chained. She could move her arms freely, could stretch them above her head, could turn over without adjusting to the weight of another person's movement. This freedom felt so unfamiliar that her body did not know what to do with it. Sleep would not come. From the bunk above, Sieglinda's voice came down in the darkness, low and conversational. "He didn't do it for us," she said in German. "He did it because chained workers are inefficient workers. Don't mistake his self-interest for kindness." Hilda looked at the ceiling. "Maybe both things are true," she said. Sieglinda did not respond. Somewhere in the barracks, someone shifted in their sleep, and the bunk frame creaked. The morning was still dark when the truck arrived. Hilda climbed into the back with 11 other women and 2 guards who sat at the tailgate, with rifles across their knees and expressions suggesting they would rather be anywhere else. The truck moved southwest through flat country that opened up as the sun came to land, going from gray to pale gold to the specific reddish-brown of Texas soil in full light. Barbed wire fences ran alongside the road in both directions. Cattle stood in small clusters in the middle distance. When the truck turned through the gate of the Colby property, Hilda saw the ranch whole for the first time: the white clapboard house with its wide porch, the red-painted barns, the windmills turning in a morning breeze that had not reached the truck yet, the pasture land rolling out in every direction, farther than she could clearly see. Mac Culver met them in the yard. He was lean and unhurried, a man in his 50s who had spent 30 years on this land and knew every inch of it in the way you know, a thing you have worked with your hands rather than simply observed. He looked at the 12 women with the evaluative gaze of someone assessing new equipment, not unkindly, simply practically. "Who's done physical labor before?" he asked through Fritz Hoffman. Hilda and Gertrude raised their hands. Hilda because her father had kept a small garden outside Berlin, and she had worked it with him from childhood. Gertrude because she had grown up on a farm in Bavaria and knew what outdoor work actually required. Mac nodded and began dividing them into work groups. Hilda and 5 others, including Lieselotte, were assigned to livestock care. Lieselotte, because of her pregnancy, would work the vegetable garden rather than the heavier animal work. Then Gertrude said something that stopped everyone. She said it in English directly to Mac Culver without waiting for Fritz Hoffman. "I can do fence work better than the others." The yard went quiet. Fritz Hoffman looked at her. Hilda looked at her. Mac Culver looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "How long have you spoken English?" Mac asked. "Long enough," Gertrude said. Mac studied her for another moment. Then he nodded. "Fence work it is." Hilda watched Gertrude move toward the tools with the composed efficiency of someone who has just played a card they have been holding for the right moment. She filed the question away. How long had Gertrude been sitting in that processing room, in that barracks, listening to every English conversation around her and giving no indication of comprehension? And what else was she holding? Lester appeared from the direction of the main house and walked them through the work expectations via Fritz Hoffman. The ranch had specific needs: the vegetable garden that supplied the household and local markets, the cattle that required daily feeding and watering, the endless fence maintenance that any working ranch demanded. He spoke practically and without condescension, the way he might brief new ranch hands, and Hilda noticed that he did not explain things twice. Opal Colby appeared at the house door while Lester was still speaking. She was a practical-looking woman in her 50s, her face carrying the particular weathering of someone who had spent decades in a dry climate doing real work. She watched the assembled women for a moment with an expression that Hilda could not immediately categorize. Not pity, not suspicion, something more like assessment combined with a private decision already made. Then she went back inside. The work began. It was harder than anything Hilda had done since childhood, and harder than most things she had done even then. By mid-morning, her back had registered its objection, and her hands had developed the hot, tight feeling that precedes blisters. She hauled hay and moved water and learned to navigate around the cattle without startling them, which required a specific kind of slow attention that Mac demonstrated once and then expected to be understood. At noon, Opal Colby appeared with lunch on wooden trays. Thick sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a large pitcher of lemonade that was cold in a way that seemed impossible given the temperature of everything else. Opal served each woman individually, placing the food into hands rather than setting it on the ground, making sure each person had enough, refilling the lemonade without being asked. Hilda drank slowly, holding the cold against the inside of her mouth as long as she could. Around her, the other women ate in the shade of a live oak tree, the guards sitting at a distance, and the quality of the silence was different from the silences she had experienced over the past 3 weeks. It was not the silence of containment. It was the silence of people who were tired from work and eating food that was good. She noticed that Opal had, before sitting down with her own lunch, produced a small notebook and a pen. She opened it and looked at the assembled women and placed it on the ground in the center of the group without explanation. Then she looked at Hilda. Hilda understood. She picked up the pen and wrote her name, her real name, Hilda Schiller. Not her prisoner number, not her designation, her name. She passed the notebook to Renati. Renati wrote her name. It went around the group, and each woman wrote her name, and Opal Colby watched each one do it and mouthed the names silently as she read them. She closed the notebook and put it in her apron pocket. That evening inside the main house, Clem Colby found the notebook on the kitchen table. He was 19 years old and walked with a slight drag on his left side from a machinery accident that had ended his expectation of enlisting. His father's brother had died in the Pacific in 1943, and Clem had been living with the particular interior damage of a young man who believes he belongs somewhere that will not have him because of something his body did wrong. He opened the notebook, read the names, closed it. His face did something while he read. Hilda was not there to see it. She would learn what it had done only later through a sequence of events that would begin the following morning when Mac Culver assigned her to fence repair on the western boundary, where Clem Colby was already waiting with a roll of wire and a silence that was not yet an opening but was not entirely a wall. The calf was dying. Hilda knew it before Lester said a word. She had been hauling water buckets from the east tank to the cattle trough. When she heard it, a sound so thin and desperate, it barely qualified as sound at all, more like the idea of a cry from something too weak to cry properly. She set the buckets down and followed the noise to the far end of the barn, where a newborn calf lay in fresh straw, all trembling legs and enormous dark eyes, its mother dead in the adjacent stall. Lester stood at the barn entrance watching her. He had not called her name. He had simply waited to see if she would find it on her own. She had. Fritz Hoffman appeared at Lester's shoulder ready to translate, but Lester spoke before Fritz could position himself. He spoke slowly, watching Hilda's face rather than Fritz's, as if testing whether she needed the translation at all. "It needs bottle feeding every few hours," Fritz said in German. "Without someone committed to the schedule, it won't survive the week. Mr. Colby is asking for a volunteer." Hilda's hand went up before she had consciously decided anything. Lester studied her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, not warmth exactly, more like careful reassessment, the look of a man revising an estimate upward. He nodded once, then spent 20 minutes showing her the formula, the precise measurements of powdered milk and warm water, the angle of the bottle, the patience required for an animal that had never learned what a rubber nipple was and had no mother to show it otherwise. "They're stubborn the first few tries," Lester said through Fritz, "but once they learn, they don't forget who fed them. You'll be its person now." Hilda knelt in the straw. The calf turned its head away from the bottle, confused and frightened by the stranger who smelled wrong and offered something unfamiliar. Hilda did not force it. She simply held the bottle at the correct angle and waited, murmuring in German without realizing she was doing it soft nonsense words, the kind she had once used to fill silence on long radio shifts when the frequencies were quiet and the night felt very long. The calf latched on. It drank with the full, desperate commitment of something that has decided after careful consideration to stay alive. Hilda felt the pull through the bottle, the small, furious life at the other end of it, and something shifted in her chest. Not broke. Opened, like a window in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. She named him Fritz quietly to herself, not in any official way. Lester watched from the entrance. He did not comment on the German words she had been using. He simply said through Fritz Hoffman, "That animal knows your voice now. That's not nothing," and walked back toward the main house. Hilda stayed in the straw for a long time after the bottle was empty. She did not notice Sergeant Harmon Slagle until she stood to leave. He was in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching. She did not know how long he had been standing there. His face held its usual carefully maintained hardness, but there was something around the edges of it that she could not name, a loosening, perhaps, or the effort required to maintain the tension against something unexpected. He said nothing for a moment, then, "My brother had a calf like that back in Oklahoma when we were kids." He did not elaborate. He did not explain why he was telling her this or what he expected her to do with the information. He simply stated it the way a man states a fact he has been carrying for too long and needs to set down briefly, even if only in front of someone who cannot fully understand its weight. Then he turned and walked out of the barn. Hilda stood alone in the smell of straw and warm milk and something indefinably alive. She thought about what Sieglinde had said 2 nights ago in the dark of the barracks, that Lester Colby's kindness was only self-interest wearing a different coat. She thought about what it meant that Slagle, who had looked at her with something close to hatred on the first day, had just told her about a calf in Oklahoma. She did not reach a conclusion. She picked up the empty bottle and went back to work. 3 days later, Sieglinde came to her in the night. The barracks were quiet, the kind of quiet that accumulates slowly after lights out when 20 women lie in various stages of wakefulness, breathing and turning, and occasionally whispering. Hilda had been almost asleep when she felt the edge of her bunk depressed slightly and looked up to find Sieglinde sitting at her feet close enough to speak without being heard 2 rows away. Sieglinde was 30, but looked older in low light. She had the face of someone who had spent years practicing certainty and was very good at it. She leaned forward and spoke in German, barely moving her lips. She had been watching the patrol rotations for 2 weeks. 3 guards rotating in 90-minute intervals with a consistent 12-minute gap on the southwest perimeter between 10:40 and 11. The railroad spur was 4 miles on a bearing she had already calculated. From the nearest town, a person with money or with something to trade could be anywhere within a day. She looked at Hilda when she finished, waiting. Renati was breathing steadily on the next bunk. Gertrude's eyes were open in the dark, looking at the ceiling, giving away nothing. Hilda said no. Sieglinde's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes went very flat. "You are German," she said. "Whatever they've told you here, whatever small kindnesses they've shown you, you are still their prisoner. You have an obligation." "To what?" Hilda said. "To a country that's losing, to a government that sent us to France in the first place." "To yourself," Sieglinde said. "To your own people." "My people are asleep in this room," Hilda said. "And you're asking me to do something that ends their work assignments and puts them back in chains." The word landed between them like something physical. Sieglinde looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood without another word and walked back to her bunk. Hilda lay awake for a very long time. She looked at the ceiling. Somewhere in the dark, she heard Gertrude shift on her bunk, but say nothing. The silence felt deliberate, like a decision being made. Morning arrived with the particular brightness of a Texas October, the season having finally broken the worst of the heat without surrendering the light. Hilda was at the truck before the other women standing in the yard, with her hands in the pockets of her work dress, watching the sky go from gray to gold. Gertrude appeared beside her. "I heard her," Gertrude said quietly in German without preamble. "Last night." Hilda said nothing. "I'm not going with her," Gertrude said, "but I'm not reporting her either." She paused. "That's your decision to make. I wanted you to know where I stand so you don't spend energy wondering." Hilda looked at her. Gertrude's face was composed and entirely unreadable, the face of a woman who had made her calculation and was presenting the result without editorializing. "Why are you telling me?" Hilda asked. "Because you'll be the one Slagle comes to if something happens," Gertrude said, "and I want you to be ready." Then she climbed into the truck. Hilda stood in the yard another moment. The sky was fully gold now. Somewhere in the far pasture, cattle moved in slow clusters toward the morning water tanks. She thought about the formula she needed to mix for Fritz. She thought about the fence section on the western boundary that she and Clem Colby were supposed to repair that afternoon. She thought about Gertrude's calm, terrible logic. She climbed into the truck. The day proceeded with the particular mundane intensity of hard work, the kind that fills the mind completely and leaves no room for anything else. Hilda hauled hay and checked water levels and spent 40 minutes in the barn with the calf, who now turned toward the sound of her footsteps before she had even produced the bottle. He was getting stronger. His legs had stopped their constant trembling. He could stand on his own for several minutes at a stretch. In the afternoon, Matt Culver assigned her to fence repair on the western boundary. Clem Colby was already there when she arrived, a roll of wire and a post driver on the ground beside him, examining a section where cattle had pushed through and bent 3 posts at odd angles. They worked in the silence that had characterized every interaction between them since the first day. Clem did not explain what needed doing. He simply began doing it, and Hilda watched long enough to understand the technique, then worked alongside him. The rhythm of it was almost companionable in the way that shared physical labor can be companionable even between people who have not yet decided whether they like each other. After an hour, Clem said without looking up from the wire he was stretching, "You ever going to ask me to teach you to rope?" Hilda stopped. "I didn't know that was an option." Max says you're better with the cattle than any hand we've had since before the war. He kept his eyes on the wire. Roping is the next thing. Hilda considered this. Is that you offering to teach me or Max suggesting it? Clem finally looked up. There was something almost amused in his face, a reluctant expression, like amusement he hadn't given himself permission for. Does it matter? Not particularly, Hilda said. She went back to hammering the staple she had been working on. Clem went back to stretching wire. The silence between them was different after that. Less like a wall, more like an agreement. But the shift had started the week before. On the afternoon, Clem had let a hay bale slip, and it knocked hard against Hilda's shoulder. She had not cried out. She stood brushed off, the dust kept working. Clem had stared at her. Then without any transition, he had said in a flat voice, "Your family's still in Germany." Hilda kept her eyes on the fence post. "My parents, Berlin." Clem was quiet for a moment. "My dad died in the Pacific, 43. He picked up the bale. Different war, I guess." "Same war," Hilda said. "Different uniforms." Clem said nothing more. But that afternoon he showed her unprompted how to brace a corner post so it would hold through a hard winter. He did not explain why he was showing her. He simply showed her. 3 days after the fence conversation about roping Sieglinde was gone, the absence was discovered at the 5:45 morning count. One bunk empty, one name unanswered. The camp moved into lockdown with the practiced efficiency of an institution that had rehearsed this scenario and found it unfortunately necessary to use the rehearsal. Within 15 minutes, every prisoner in the women's section was assembled in the processing yard. Guards positioned at each corner. Slogel appeared within 20 minutes of the alarm. He had clearly dressed quickly, but there was nothing hurried about the way he moved through the assembled women, slow and deliberate, reading faces. When he reached Hilda, he stopped. "Did you know?" he said. Hilda looked at him. The morning air was cold, in a way Texas mornings sometimes were in November, a chill that surprised you because you had been tricked by the afternoons into believing the season had no teeth. She could see her breath. "No," she said. Slogel looked at her for a long moment. Not the quick assessment of someone deciding whether to believe a simple denial. The longer look of someone who already knows the answer and is watching to see if the person in front of them knows that he knows. "You're lying," he said, not loudly, almost conversationally. "I didn't go with her," Hilda said. "I didn't help her. I'm standing here." "That's not what I asked." "Maybe not," Hilda said, "but it's what I can tell you." Another long silence. The cold air moved between them. Slagel's jaw worked slightly the way it did when he was processing something that did not fit cleanly into any category he had available. "If she makes it to town," he said finally, "they close this work program, all of it. Every woman in this compound goes back to restricted status." "I know," Hilda said. "Then why didn't you?" "Because she was going whether I told you or not," Hilda said. "And I thought maybe she wouldn't make it far. And I thought if I told you, you would look at all of us differently, all 20 of us, and the work would end anyway." She paused. "I was trying to protect the program." Slogel stared at her. Something moved through his expression that she could not fully name. Anger, certainly, but something else underneath it. Something that looked unexpectedly like reluctant respect, the kind a man feels when an opponent outmaneuvers him cleanly, and he has enough character to acknowledge it, even while resenting it. He walked away without another word. Sieglinde was found 6 hours later in an abandoned equipment shed 4 miles from the camp perimeter, exhausted and severely dehydrated, having badly misjudged both the terrain and the October night temperatures. She had not made it to the railroad spur. She had barely made it past the second fence line. She was transferred to restricted housing that afternoon. Hilda never saw her again. That evening, the tension in the barracks had a particular texture, not quite relief and not quite guilt. Something in between. Renate sat on her bunk and said quietly, "You knew, didn't you?" It was not a question. "Yes," Hilda said. Renate was quiet for a moment. "Then thank you." Hilda said nothing. She was thinking about Slagel's face when she had said she was trying to protect the program. The way the anger had moved to make room for something else. She was not sure what to do with that. That same evening, a harder conversation was happening inside the main house of the Colby Ranch. Clem had come in from the south pasture and found Lester at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. Lester had heard about Sieglinde's escape attempt from Mac that afternoon. He sat with it the way he sat with all difficult information, quietly turning it over. Clem poured himself water and stood at the counter. "One of them tried to run," he said. I heard, Lester said. Doesn't that change things? Clem asked. The question was genuine, not rhetorical. He was 19 and he was trying to understand how his uncle's logic held up under this new fact. Lester looked at his cup. One of them tried to run, he said. 19 didn't. Clem was quiet. You want to judge the 19 for what the one did? Lester said, that's your right. But I've been running cattle for 40 years. You don't cull a herd because one animal spooked. You figure out why it spooked and you fix the fence. Clem set down his glass. He looked at his uncle for a long moment. Then he walked out the back door without another word. Hilda did not know this conversation had happened. She was sitting in the barracks running her thumb over the faded marks on her wrists when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main house. Then silence. Then the sound of a door. She looked out the small, high window and saw Clem standing alone in the backyard looking at the sky, his jaw set. He stood there for a long time. In the morning, he was at the fence line before she arrived. He did not mention the night before. He simply handed her a pair of roping gloves, different from the work gloves she had been using, thinner and more precise. Max says you've got the hands for it, he said. Let's see. He spent the afternoon teaching her. The lesson was entirely practical. No conversation about Germany or the war or dead fathers or escape attempts. Just the mechanics of rope and motion and the patience required to develop a skill that looked simple and was not. By the end of the afternoon, Hilda had not roped anything successfully, but she understood the principle and her hands knew the grip. She was still a prisoner. That remained absolutely true. But she was learning something that no one had asked her to learn, something that served no military purpose, something that existed purely in the category of a person acquiring a skill because that person was capable of acquiring it. The following week, Slagle appeared at the ranch for what he described as a routine security inspection. He walked the perimeter with Mac, checked the truck schedules, reviewed the guard rotation. Standard procedure following an escape attempt. Hilda watched him from across the yard, and he did not approach her. But in the late afternoon, when the other women had loaded onto the truck and Hilda was finishing the last of the evening water checks, she turned to find Slagle standing 20 feet away alone. He spoke without preamble. I went back through your file, he said, more carefully this time. Hilda held the water bucket and waited. You were captured in a village in northern France, Slagle said. June 4th, 1944. She said nothing. The Normandy landings were June 6th, he said, 48 hours after you were captured. He looked at her steadily, which means you weren't transmitting on June 6th. Whatever coordinates you sent before your capture, you couldn't have sent anything during the operation. The late afternoon light lay across the yard. Somewhere in the corral, the calf moved in the straw. I've been holding something against you, Slagle said. That wasn't yours to carry. Hilda looked at him. She had spent months carrying the weight of that invisible accusation, the question he had asked her on the first day how many people had died because of what she had done. She had not had an answer then. She still did not have an answer that satisfied her completely. War did not work in clean lines of cause and effect. I transmitted coordinates, she said. I don't know what they became. I never knew. That's how it worked. I know, Slagle said. They stood in the yard. The truck horn sounded from the gate calling the count. Slagle looked toward it, then back at Hilda. You should go, he said. She went. But something had shifted, not resolved, not forgiven in either direction, but shifted the way a door shifts when a hinge is repaired, not opening yet, but no longer stuck. Lester gathered the 20 women in the barn on a Saturday afternoon in late November. Fritz Hoffman stood ready at his shoulder. Outside, the last of the autumn light came through the gaps in the old wood in long amber bars, catching dust motes and making them look like something deliberate. A horse stamped in the neighboring stall. The smell of hay and leather and the faint sweetness of the feed mix Hilda had learned to make for the calf. Lester removed his hat. He held it in both hands and looked at each woman in turn, taking his time. And the quality of his attention was such that each woman felt individually seen rather than collectively addressed. He spoke about what they had built over the past 4 months, not in the language of efficiency or productivity, though he acknowledged the work had been excellent and the ranch had survived a season it might not have survived otherwise. He spoke about something harder to quantify. He said he had not been sure when he had argued for the removal of the chains that first morning, whether the argument he made about workplace safety was the real reason or just the convenient one. He had not examined his own motives very carefully at the time. He was examining them now. Fritz Hoffman's voice was careful and steady as he translated. The women listened without moving. Lester said that what the last 4 months had demonstrated to him was that the chains had never been necessary, not practically and not morally, that the security they represented had always been an illusion, a way of making visible an authority that did not need to make itself visible through metal and locks, because authority exercised through basic decency was stronger than anything you could weld onto a person's wrists. He looked at Hilda when he said it. He said that the war would end. He did not know when. He knew which direction it was going. When it ended, they would be sent home, and home would be difficult. He did not pretend otherwise. But he wanted them to carry something back with them that was harder to destroy than a building or a government. You're not prisoners first. Fritz Hoffman translated, his voice carrying a slight unevenness on the last word. You're not Germans first. You're people first. People with skills and worth and dignity that exists independently of what nations do to each other. He looked directly at Hilda. You became a cowgirl in Texas. Nobody planned that, but you did it, and you did it well. That's who you are. Someone capable of learning hard things and doing difficult work with skill and with grace. Several women were crying silently. Hilda was not. She was looking at Lester Colby's face and thinking about what Gertrude had said in the barracks the night before, about choosing what to tell your family, about what version of this time you wanted them to remember. Gertrude had written home about the man who cut the chains. Hilda had not yet written at all. She was thinking about her parents' apartment building and whether it still stood. From the side entrance of the barn, Clem Colby stepped into the light. He had been standing outside, and for how long none of them knew. He walked to where Lester stood at the front of the assembled women and positioned himself beside his uncle. He said nothing. He did not need to. The act of standing there in that room beside the man he had argued with was the sentence. Lester looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the women. He put a hand briefly on Clem's shoulder. After the barn meeting, Lester gave each woman a parting gift. Leather work gloves, worn but solid, accompanied by a handwritten note. Hilda's note included an extra line, "You're welcome back if you ever want to visit. A cowgirl always has a place on this ranch." She folded it and put it in her pocket next to the letter she had been carrying for 3 weeks, but had not opened. That night in the barracks, Gertrude came to her with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to say something they have been holding for a long time. "I wrote to my family last month," Gertrude said. "I told them I was all right. I told them about the work, about the calf." She paused. "I didn't tell them about Sieglinde. I told them about the man who cut the chains on the first day, and I told them that he said people first." She looked at Hilda steadily. "That's what I want them to remember about me during this time. Not what I survived, what I saw." Hilda held that for a moment. Then she said, "How did you know English before you told Mac?" Gertrude almost smiled. "My grandmother was from Pennsylvania. She married a Bavarian farmer and moved to Germany before the First War. She spoke English at home until the day she died." She paused. "I never told anyone in the Army. It seemed like something worth keeping to myself." "Why tell Mac Culver?" "Because I could see he respected competence more than he respected anything else," Gertrude said. "And I wanted to be seen as competent before anything else, before German, before prisoner." Hilda lay awake after Renati's breathing had deepened into sleep. She thought about Lester's speech. She thought about Gertrude's grandmother in Pennsylvania. She thought about the calf growing stronger each day. She thought about Clem stepping into the barn and standing beside his uncle without a word. The grooves on her wrists had faded to faint white lines. She ran her thumb over them in the dark. She was still a prisoner. The fences around Camp Hearn were real. The guards on the truck were real. She would go back to a country that was losing badly. But she had also become something she had not been on the day the chains came off. She could ride a horse well enough to move cattle alone. She knew 5,000 acres of Texas land. She had kept a living creature alive. She had made a decision on the morning of Sieglinde's disappearance about who she was and what she was willing to protect. She was thinking all of this when she heard it. Boots on gravel outside the barracks. Stopping outside the wall nearest her bunk. A long silence. Then a single exhale, quiet and human, the kind a man releases when he stops walking and lets something out that has been held too long. Then the boots moved away. She lay still. She did not know who it was. She thought she knew. She closed her eyes. She thought about the fence she and Clem had repaired that would stand for years. She thought about a calf who turned toward the sound of her footsteps. She thought about a notebook with her real name written in it, in Opal Colby's careful hand. She slept. She did not know and would not know until morning that Lester Colby had already written to the camp commandant requesting that Hilda Schiller be permitted to remain on expanded work assignment through the following spring season. She did not know the request had been approved that same afternoon. She did not know that Clem Colby had earlier that same day brought a camera out to the eastern pasture and taken a photograph without explaining why, a photograph of Hilda on horseback in the low November light, squinting into the lens with the expression of someone who has forgotten briefly to be afraid. On the back of that photograph, Clem had written a few words in pencil, then crossed them out, then written them again more firmly. What those words were, Hilda would not discover until she was standing in a food line in Berlin in the autumn of 1945, in the ruins of a city she no longer entirely recognized, next to a woman named Renati, who had kept the photograph in her coat pocket for the entire journey home. The war ended on a Tuesday. Hilda was in the east pasture, moving a small group of cattle toward the spring water tank, when she heard the truck horn from the direction of the main house, 3 long blasts, the signal Lester had told them weeks ago he would use if the news came while they were out on the land. She pulled her horse to a stop. Around her, the cattle continued their slow, indifferent walk toward the water. The sky was enormous and pale blue in the way of Texas mornings in early May, the kind of sky that did not seem to register human events as particularly significant. She sat in the saddle for a moment without moving. Then she turned the horse and rode back. The other women were already gathering in the yard by the time she arrived. Lester stood on the porch steps with a radio visible through the open door behind him, a voice still speaking from it in the measured tones of official announcement. Opal stood beside him with her hands folded in front of her. Fritz Hoffman had his hat in his hands. Clem was leaning against the fence post at the edge of the yard, arms crossed, face unreadable. Lester looked at the assembled women. He said in English slowly enough that most of them could follow without waiting for Fritz. "It's over. Germany surrendered this morning." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of 20 women who had known this was coming and had still not found a way to fully prepare for the moment it arrived. Some of them had tears on their faces almost immediately. Some stood very still with expressions that suggested they were calculating something, running numbers on what this meant for people they had not seen in years. Renati reached for Hilda's arm and held it without speaking. Hilda looked at Lester. He was looking back at her with that careful expression she had come to know over 10 months, the expression of a man who understood that he was witnessing something he did not have the full context for, and who had the decency to hold his silence rather than fill it with the wrong words. "Work's still here," he said after a moment. "If you want." They worked. The day had a strange quality, not lighter than usual, not heavier, but different in texture, like a fabric with an altered weave that looks the same from a distance but feels changed under your hands. Hilda fed the calf in the late morning. He was enormous now, no longer the trembling newborn she had knelt beside in October, but a solid, healthy animal who associated the sound of the barn door with her arrival and positioned himself accordingly. She brought a measure of feed and stood beside him while he ate, her hand resting on his neck, and thought about her parents. The last letter she had received through the Red Cross had been in February. Her father was ill. The apartment had sustained damage in the November raids. Her mother was managing. These were the facts she had carried through the winter, turning them over regularly the way you tend something that cannot be fixed from a distance, but must not be forgotten either. She did not know yet that those letters had stopped arriving because there was no longer anyone to send them. She would not know that for 3 more months. In the afternoon, Gertrude found her at the fence line on the northern boundary, the farthest point from the main house where the land rolled slightly, and you could see a long way in every direction without obstruction. Gertrude sat on the top rail and looked at the horizon. Hilda stood beside her and did the same. "I've been trying to imagine going home," Gertrude said. "I can't get the picture to form properly. Every time I try, I see Bavaria the way it was in 1941, and I know it isn't like that anymore, but I don't know what to replace the image with." Hilda understood exactly what she meant. She had the same problem with Berlin. The city she carried in memory was a city of a specific era, specific light, specific sounds, and she knew intellectually that it had been substantially destroyed. But destroyed in her mind only meant the absence of what had been there, not the presence of something new and real. I keep seeing my parents' kitchen, Hilda said. The window that looked out on the courtyard, the way the light came in at 4 in the afternoon in winter. Gertrude nodded. Then she said, "Do you think we'll recognize ourselves when we get back? I mean, who we've become here." It was the most direct question Gertrude had ever asked her. Hilda considered it seriously. "I think we'll recognize ourselves more than we recognize the place," she said finally. Gertrude looked at her, then she looked back at the horizon. "That might be the hardest part," she said. Hilda's last day at the Colby Ranch was a Thursday in late July. She had spent the 2 weeks before it working with the intensity of someone who intends to leave nothing undone. Every fence section she had repaired, she walked one final time. Every water tank she maintained, she checked and adjusted. She spent an extra 30 minutes with the calf on each of the final 4 mornings, standing beside him in the barn, with her hand on his neck, not saying anything, just being present in the way that mattered to an animal who had learned to trust her. On the last morning Lester met her in the barn, Fritz Hoffman was not with him. Hilda's English was good enough now that this was no longer a problem. Lester looked at the calf, then at Hilda. "He'll be all right," he said. "Clem's taken over the feeding schedule. He's attached to him now, too." "He attaches easily," Hilda said. "He's generous that way." Lester almost smiled. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Inside was the handwritten note she already had, but then also a second sheet of paper, a letter of reference written in Lester's careful hand, describing her skills, her reliability, her competence with livestock and land management. At the bottom he had written, "I recommend her without reservation for any agricultural or supervisory position. She is the finest worker I have employed in 40 years of ranching and a person of exceptional character." Hilda read it standing in the barn with the calf breathing beside her. She had to read the last sentence twice. "You may not need it," Lester said, "but you might. And I wanted you to have something that said in plain English what you proved here." She folded the letter carefully. The right words were not available in either language she possessed, and Lester Colby, who had spent a lifetime communicating across the silence of open land, probably understood this. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate. It was also exactly right. Clem was in the yard when she came out of the barn. He held something, a small square of paper, and extended it toward her without ceremony. It was a photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed on one side from the low November light. Hildy on horseback, squinting into the lens with the open pasture stretching behind her. She looked capable. She looked at home. She looked like someone who belonged to the land she was standing on, which was not a country she had ever imagined belonging to and which she was leaving in 3 days. She turned it over. Clem had written in pencil, "Hilda Schiller, Cowgirl, Texas, 1944. Below that in smaller letters, as if added later, "Some people find where they belong in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's not bad luck. That's just how it works sometimes." Hilda looked at the words for a long moment. Then she looked at Clem. He was looking at the middle distance with the studious attention of someone examining something very interesting on the horizon. "Thank you," she said. "Max says there's a fence section on the south boundary needs work," Clem said, still looking at the horizon. "Figured I'd get to it this afternoon." "It's the third post from the dry creek," Hilda said. "The wood's rotted through at the base. You'll need to replace the post, not just reset it." Clem nodded, still not looking at her. "I'll remember that." She put the photograph in her pocket next to Lester's letter. The journey home reversed the journey out, trucks to trains to ships. The Atlantic in late summer, gray-green water under overcast skies. No chains. Guards who looked bored rather than alert. Other women from other camps. Other stories, other faces bearing the particular expressions of people in transit between a past they were leaving and a future they could not yet see. Hilda stood at the ship's railing on the third night out and looked at water she could not see the bottom of. Renati stood beside her. They had not talked much on the journey, not because there was nothing to say, but because so much needed to be said that the beginning kept moving. "What do you think it will look like?" Renati asked. She meant Germany. She meant home. "I don't know," Hilda said. "I think we'll have to let it be what it is instead of what we remember." Renat was quiet. "Then do you think we'll find anyone?" Hilda had been thinking about her parents' kitchen window. She said, "I hope so." The Atlantic moved under them. Hamburg was unrecognizable. Not destroyed, not damaged, not ruined, though. All of those were accurate, unrecognizable. She had been to Hamburg twice before the war, and the city she had carried in memory bore no useful relationship to what stood before her in August of 1945. Where the memory held buildings, there were now shapes that had once been buildings. The smell was specific and unlike anything she had encountered before, dust and damp, and something underneath both that she understood without wanting to. She did not stay in Hamburg. Berlin was a longer journey through fractured rail connections and checkpoint bureaucracy, and it took her 4 days to cover a distance that had once taken 6 hours. When she arrived, she did not recognize the city either, but she recognized the geography under the destruction, the curve of streets she had walked since childhood, the shape of the land under the rubble. That familiarity was disorienting in its own way, like hearing a voice you know coming from a face you don't. Her parents' building had taken a direct hit in the November raids. The structure that had once contained their apartment, her childhood bedroom, the kitchen with the window that looked onto the courtyard, was now a specific shape of broken concrete and twisted metal that a neighbor could point to and say, that was number 14. The neighbor was Bernhard Stengel, who had taught mathematics at her school, and was now 73 years old and living in a portion of his own building that had survived because it faced a different direction. He took her hands when he saw her. He did not say anything immediately. He simply held her hands for a moment, and in that gesture said everything about what the last 3 years had contained. He brought her inside. He made tea with leaves that had been used twice before, and gave her the last of a small quantity of sugar he had been saving. Then he told her what she needed to know. Her parents had died in the February raids of 1945, together in the shelter beneath the building when the shelter took a direct hit. They had not suffered long. They had been buried in a common grave in the Marzahn district with 400 others, and the grave was marked, and she could find it. He told her this carefully and without unnecessary detail. When he finished, Hilda sat with the cup of twice-used tea in her hands and looked at the table. She was aware of Bernhard Stengel sitting quietly across from her, not rushing her. She thought about her mother's handwriting, her father's laugh, the kitchen window. Then Bernhard stood and went to a shelf and took down a small tin box that she recognized because it had lived on the top shelf of her father's wardrobe for as long as she could remember. He set it on the table in front of her. "Your father gave it to me 2 years ago," Bernhard said. "He said if anything happens and Hilda comes home, give her this." Her hands were steady when she opened it. Inside, a photograph of her parents taken in 1938 before everything. 3 letters she had sent from France before her capture, and a single sheet of paper in her father's handwriting. The paper said, "For Hilda, if she comes home, I hope the world was kind to you somewhere along the way, even in the middle of all this. I hope you found people worth knowing. We love you. Come home." Hilda read it 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket next to Lester's letter and Clem's photograph. 3 pieces of paper. 3 different people's evidence that she had existed, had mattered, had been worth addressing directly. She sat with Bernhard Stengel for another hour and talked about small things. When she left, he pressed a small quantity of bread into her hands without comment. Outside, the late summer light lay across the ruins in a way that was almost beautiful in the manner of things that have been broken and have not yet decided what they will become. Hilda stood on the street in front of the rubble that had been number 14 and looked at it for a long time. She was 25 years old. She had no family, no apartment, no job, no city she fully recognized. She had a tin box, a letter from her father, a letter of reference from a Texas rancher, a photograph of herself on horseback, and a pair of leather work gloves at the bottom of her bag that still smelled faintly of the specific combination of hay and cattle and Texas dust that she knew she would never encounter exactly again. She put the gloves on. They were still too large. Her fingers did not reach the tips. They never had. But she had worked 10 months in these gloves, and they held the shape of her hands in the leather. The particular wear patterns of her grip, the places where she had held fence wire and pitchfork handles, and a bottle for an orphaned calf. She found work in the reconstruction. Physical labor, the clearing and hauling and stacking that preceded rebuilding work that required the calloused hands and resilient backs she had developed over 10 months of Texas ranch work. She was stronger than most of the other women doing this work, and this was noted, and she was given more responsibility and slightly better pay. She found Renati in a food line in the American sector on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 weeks after her return. They recognized each other across 20 meters of gray morning and pushed through the crowd toward each other with an urgency that surprised them both. They held each other in the middle of the food line, and the people around them parted to accommodate this without complaint. Because in Berlin, in October of 1945, such reunions were common enough that strangers understood to make room for them. They talked for 4 hours standing and then sitting on the steps of a partially cleared building. Renate had found her sister alive in Munich. Lieselotte had reached her family in Saxony, and the baby, a girl she named Opal after the rancher's wife, who had written down her name in a notebook, was healthy and growing. Gertrude had made it to Bavaria and written once saying she intended to study agriculture formally at the university in Munich when it reopened. She wants to run a farm, Renate said with something between amusement and genuine respect. She says Lester Colby taught her more about land management than she learned in 3 years of theory. Lester Colby taught all of us more than we expected, Hilda said. Then Renate reached into her coat pocket and produced the photograph. She held it out without preamble, the way she had been carrying it for the entire journey home, waiting for this moment. Hilda took it. She had seen it before the November light, the horse herself squinting at the lens. She turned it over and read Klem's words again, standing in the ruins of Berlin in October, reading a note written by a 19-year-old boy on a Texas ranch. Some people find where they belong in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's not bad luck. That's just how it works sometimes. She held the photograph for a long time. Renate waited. He wasn't wrong, Hilda said finally. No, Renate agreed. He wasn't. Hilda put the photograph back in her pocket next to her father's letter and Lester's reference. She looked out at the street, at the slow work of people moving through a broken city, with the particular determination of those who have decided without ceremony to continue. The years that followed were not easy, but they were hers. She worked reconstruction for 18 months, then found a position with a small agricultural cooperative reestablishing farming operations in the eastern districts, land management, livestock, care, the practical knowledge she had accumulated over 10 months of Texas mornings. She was promoted twice in 3 years. By 1950, she was supervising a team of 12 and had developed a reputation for reading land and animal conditions with an accuracy that was, she knew, simply the accumulated attention of someone who had spent years learning to pay close attention to the world directly in front of them. Berlin rebuilt itself around her slowly and then faster. She watched it happen from a small apartment in a building that had survived because it stood on the lee side of a hill. The window did not look onto a courtyard, it looked onto a street. But in the late afternoons in winter, the light came through it at an angle that reminded her of something she could not quite name, and she had learned to accept that some things could only be approximated, not recovered. In 1965, a letter arrived from Texas. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she read the return address. Lester Colby, the same careful, deliberate script that had written her letter of reference and the note about a cowgirl always having a place on his ranch. He was 79 years old. He wrote that he had thought about the German women who had worked his ranch many times over the 20 years since the war, had wondered what had become of them. Hoped they had found their way through the difficulty he knew must have awaited them. He wrote that the ranch was still operating, that Clem had taken over most of the management, that Matt Culver had retired in 1958. He wrote that the calf she had named Fritz had lived to 11 years old, which was a good long life for a ranch animal, and that he had been to the end an animal of unusually good temperament. He wrote that if she was ever in Texas, she should come by, that a cowgirl always had a place on his ranch. Hilda wrote back the same week. She described her work, her apartment, the city rebuilding around her. She described finding Renate, finding Bernhard Stengel, losing her parents. She told him about the letter of reference, which she had used 4 times over 20 years, once in 1946 when the cooperative hired her, and 3 more times since, and which she kept in the tin box with her father's letter. She told him that she still had the gloves, that they still fit the way they always had, which was to say imperfectly and exactly right. She told him that she thought about the day the chains came off more than she thought about almost anything else from those years. Not with grief, with something she could only describe as orientation, the way a navigator returns to a fixed point to confirm position. He had demonstrated in a single practical decision made for pragmatic reasons that the way you treated people was a choice, not a circumstance. It did not require the right conditions or the right moment. It only required the decision. He wrote back within 10 days. That wasn't generosity. That was just decency. I'm glad it meant something. I'm glad you survived it all. They wrote to each other irregularly for the next 7 years. In 1968, between two letters from Lester, a letter arrived from Tulsa, Oklahoma. The return name was H. Slagle. She read it, standing at her kitchen counter. He had found her address through the Red Cross, had been looking for it for 3 years. He wrote that he had said something to her on in the first morning at Camp Hearn, a question about how many people had died because of her work, and that he had been wrong to say it. He had thought about it for 20 years. He had thought about what it meant that she had been captured 2 days before Normandy. He wrote, "I blamed you for something that wasn't yours to carry. I knew it eventually. I wanted you to know I knew it. I also want you to know that the afternoon I told you about my brother's calf, I drove back to camp and sat in the truck for a long time before going inside. I don't entirely know why I told you that. I think I needed someone to know that he existed as more than a name on a casualty report. You were the only person nearby who wasn't going to use it against me. I'm grateful you didn't." Hilda sat down at the kitchen table. She read the letter twice. Then she took out a sheet of paper and wrote back. She did not write about forgiveness because the words seemed to position her above him in a way that felt inaccurate. They had both carried things they should not have been asked to carry in a war that had distributed impossible weights without discrimination. What she felt was not the authority to forgive, but the desire to lay something down. She wrote, "I remember you. I remember the question. I carried it too for years, not because it was fair, but because it was a real question, and I did not have an answer that satisfied me. I still don't. I have made my peace with not having one. I hope you have found the same. I also remember the calf in the barn, the way you said it, just those 2 sentences, like you needed to put it down somewhere safe for a moment. I understood that. I still do." Briggs wrote back once more a short note. "Thank you. I hope Berlin is everything it was." She wrote back, "Almost getting there." After that, the correspondence ended not from coldness, but from completion. Some things do not need to continue indefinitely to be resolved. Lester Colby died in April of 1972. His daughter sent a telegram, followed by a letter enclosing a copy of the obituary and a note. Dad spoke of the German women from the ranch many times. He used them as an example in arguments about what people were capable of when treated decently. He considered it one of the things he was most proud of in his life. Hilda put the obituary in the tin box. She lived in Berlin for the rest of her life, through the years of division and the gradual accumulation of prosperity. In the extraordinary autumn of 1989, when the wall came down, and she stood in the street at 69 years old and watched people climb concrete that had defined the boundary of her world for decades, and thought about another boundary, another day, a sound she had carried for 45 years. She had a niece, Monica, her brother's daughter, who became a historian and wrote her doctoral thesis on the prisoner labor programs of the American Southwest during the Second World War. Monica interviewed Hildy extensively in the early 1990s, recording hours of conversation about Camp Hearn, the Colby Ranch, Lester and Opal and Clem and Mac Culver, about Sieglinde and the night of the escape attempt, about the calf and the fence lines she had walked for 10 months, about the photograph. Monica had it framed. She hung it in her office at the university next to a copy of the relevant section of her thesis. Hildy on horseback. November light. Clem's handwriting on the back. Hilda died in November of 1998 at 78 years old in her apartment in Berlin on a Thursday morning with a late autumn light coming through the window at the angle it always came. She had lived long enough to see her city rebuild, entirely to see the wall fall, to see her country do the long and imperfect and necessary work of becoming something different than it had been. In the tin box that Monica found in the wardrobe, there were a photograph of her parents from 1938, 3 letters sent from France, her father's note, Lester Colby's letter of reference creased from years of folding and unfolding, Clem's photograph still in reasonable condition, 3 letters from Lester, 1 letter from Harmon Slagle, and a pair of leather work gloves, oversized, worn through at the index finger of the right hand, still carrying somewhere in their material the specific smell of a ranch in Texas in the autumn of 1944. Monica held the gloves for a long time. Then she put them back in the box and closed the lid and sat in her aunt's apartment on a Thursday morning in November with the light coming through the window and thought about what it meant to inherit a story. Not the facts of it. The facts were in the thesis, were documented, were archived. What she was holding was something else, the physical evidence of a choice someone had made in a specific moment that had altered the course of everything that followed. Lester Colby had looked at a group of women in chains and decided that the chains were unnecessary. He had made that decision for practical reasons, and the practical reasons were real, and the practical reasons were not the whole of it. Some decisions are made for one reason and turn out to mean something larger, and the person who makes them only understands the larger meaning afterward, if ever. Hilda had understood it. She had spent 50 years understanding it, refining her understanding, testing it against new circumstances, finding it consistent. Monica kept the tin box. Years later, when she taught the history of this period, she brought it to class once near the end of the semester. She did not open it in front of the students. She placed it on the desk and talked about what was inside and what it meant that those particular objects had been kept together for 50 years by a person who survived a world that had tried to reduce her to a category. After class, a student asked why the gloves mattered. They were just gloves, worn out, didn't even fit properly. Monica thought about how to answer. She thought about Hilda on horseback in November light. She thought about a calf named Fritz, about a notebook with real names about chains that hit a floor in Texas and changed the direction of a life. Because she wore them, Monica said finally, not because she had to, because she chose to, because they were given to her by someone who decided she was a person first, and she wore them until the leather wore through and she kept them after that. That's what they mean. That's all they mean, and that's enough.